Hello everyone, today I want to talk about how I made my latest custom Super Mario Bros. Wonder level, which is called Surge Steelworks. This level's main gimmick of amps electrifying metal blocks was basically taken directly from one of the rooms in the final castle of the mod newer Super Mario Bros. DS. Though I added onto the idea by making metallic mushroom platforms that extend when the block they emerge from is electrified, a pushable version of the metal block, and the ability for the gimmicks to interact with little sparkies. Since almost everything about these setups, including the amps, is fully custom, I will explain how I made all of this stuff in a separate upcoming video. For the level's wonder effect, I came up with the idea of combining amps with floating water bubbles, which was actually inspired by one of my own old custom levels. Though in New Super Mario Bros. U, it wasn't possible for me to make the amps electrify the bubbles, so it was cool to revisit the idea in Wonder and finally make that work. Anyways, now let's talk about the specifics of the level design process. It's weird to think about how much I used to live and breathe Super Mario Bros. Wonder level creation. I'd spend a week making a level, then a few days making the videos about said level, and then go straight into working on the next level. Because over the past year or so, I've often spent several weeks or even months focused on making other types of videos, actually starting work on a new level has become more and more of an event for me. Before making this level, I spent nearly a week brainstorming ideas and setting up the custom mechanics and whatnot, and then I also spent a few hours just messing around with the Fushigi level editor to make sure I knew what I was doing. On the one hand, I'd say this has a tangible effect on my levels. They're more thought out and polished than ever before, I'd say, but it does also mean that the rate at which I make levels has slowed down significantly, so it's a bit of a trade-off. One of the reasons why I spent some time getting used to Fushigi again before working on this level is because the editor is still being updated very regularly. I started working on this level during the Fushigi 1.8 beta phase, but as I'm recording this, that update has already come out and 1.9 is being worked on. 1.8 introduced a lot of quality of life improvements, like less finicky rails and global links and terrain placement, and the ability to look up talking flower voice lines in the editor itself, but my favorite additions are definitely the actor rotation and ring generation features, which allow things like coin or enemy circles to be set up in the editor without needing to mess around with an external calculator or anything. It's kind of hilarious thinking about how many hours of my life this feature would have saved had it been implemented before I made some of my previous levels, which relied on large amount of actor circles, but even still, it came in handy repeatedly throughout the creation process of this level, and I'm sure I'll make use of it even more in the future. Just like the custom grinders in one of my previous levels, the amps move by being bound to rails or other types of movement controllers. Now, the way most movement controllers work is that they snap the actors that are attached to them to specific coordinates relative to the controller, which means it's impossible to manually change the coordinates of actors when they're bound to something. This was a problem for the amps, since they needed to go in front of both the metal blocks and the level terrain, which would only happen if I gave them a high Z position value, which gets reset when the amps are attached to something like a rotation movement controller. During this early part of the level creation process, I got around to that issue by attaching the amps that I wanted to rotate to circular rails, with each rail point set to a high Z value instead of using rotation movement controllers, but later I came up with setups where circular rails wouldn't work. So I had to come up with a different solution, which was to move the model of the metal blocks down to a much lower Z position, which allowed the amps to move in front of them by default. Before starting work on the level, I made a very important choice regarding the amps that affected the way I integrated them into a bunch of setups. See, in just about all of their appearances in older games, amps are basic enemies that can be defeated. But I realized that if I was gonna allow my amps to be killed, they could never be integral to the level design in the way I wanted them to be, because every setup would have to work with or without them. Therefore, my custom amps are unkillable. That might make you wonder though, if the amps are unkillable, what's the point of the level featuring the elephant transformation? Well, the level had to feature some kind of power-up, and although being an elephant doesn't allow you to defeat any of the level's enemies, it does make pushing blocks much easier. I never really intended for the level to sort of revolve around pushable blocks in the way it ended up doing. I just came up with the metallic pushable block gimmick, realized I needed to set that idea up somehow, and before I knew it, every other section features some kind of pushable block puzzle. And using the elephant transformation makes these sections much quicker, so that all worked out pretty nicely, I think. Though in other ways, using this level's gimmicks was an exercise in restraint. When I first came up with the idea of making some of the metal blocks do things other than simply be electrified, I was imagining all sorts of crazy stuff that might happen. I could have made metal blocks that would move when electrified, or trigger on-off blocks, or get destroyed, or shoot out a beam of electricity. As you've probably seen in some of my other levels, when it comes to signal-activated stuff in Super Mario Bros. Wonder, the possibilities are almost endless. However, I do also feel like I maybe took things too far in some of those levels. I'm still striving for my levels to feel Nintendo-y, so having one level feature 5 different complicated variations of the same gimmick would be too much. That's why the extendable purple mushroom mechanic was the perfect compromise. It still brought my idea of making the metal blocks activate other gimmicks to life, whilst also limiting the craziness of the setups I could make with this idea. And I'm still very happy with the stuff I came up with when it comes to the mushrooms. I'd much rather use a smaller amount of simpler mechanics in as many ways as possible than spam a single level with a dozen different complex custom mechanics just for the sake of it. Something I used to be known for basically in my new Super Mario Bros. U modding days was making frequent use of autoscrollers. There was something about the way autoscrollers allow you to design the exact way in which the player would encounter every gimmick that I really loved. With the customization Super Mario Bros. Wonder allows for, I haven't felt the need to make as many auto-scrolling sections, but the idea of making a vertical elevator segment where the metal blocks move towards the amps instead of the other way around was too good of an opportunity for me to pass up. The biggest challenge of making this section was certainly trying to make it both feel like there's a lot of stuff going on, whilst also making the obstacles as manageable as possible. So I ended up tweaking the positions and timings of each individual amp quite a bit. There was an idea I had for this level that I only ended up implementing very subtly, which was that the visuals of the level environment would change quite drastically after the vertical autoscroller. The original game's level Missile Meg Mayhem, which this one is technically an edit of, takes the player above the clouds that normally cover this level theme during its Wonder Effect section. And I thought, since this level sort of randomly progresses vertically halfway through, differentiating the second half by giving it a background that looks out over the clouds would be a cool way of making the level structure feel more realistic. However, as I talked about in my custom rainbow actor creation video, the water bubbles that I was gonna use during the Wonder effect basically break the material used for clouds when you look at them through the bubbles. And also, my two most recent levels before this one were both already cloud themed. So I ended up deciding to make the thematic differentiation more subtle by removing the green lava from the background used in this part of the level and making the overall lighting brighter. Despite what I talked about earlier, the level still ended up revolving around quite a number of different ideas and gimmicks and mechanics. So in this second half, the main challenge for me was to pay off all of the ways I'd set up those ideas in the first half of the level. For example, one of the first contraptions in the level involves amps being moved by a pulley, but then that idea doesn't appear again for several minutes of gameplay. So I had to make sure that it was integrated into a significant portion of this latter half of the level, or else the first setup shouldn't have been included at all. Though I say that as if it was ever a possibility. Of course, in reality, the only reason I included the earlier pulley setup was because I'd already thought of what I was gonna do with it in this part of the level. Since here I take advantage of the fact that some amps can be controlled by pulleys and also electrify blocks that then trigger the extension of mushrooms to make a section where the player has to make an amp trigger a group of extendable mushrooms in sequence to allow them to progress. This also adds a tiny bit of vertical progression to the zone, which is something I integrate into most of my levels to make them feel a bit less monotonous. Even though I was happy with all the ways I managed to use the extendable metallic mushrooms, at this point I had still yet to find a way of using the upside down versions of the gimmick. The problem with those is that they crush and kill you if you're on the mushroom whilst it retracts into the metal block. Thankfully though, I came up with a way of combining the upside down mushrooms with another amp and pulley setup through the creation of the bonus room for the third purple 10 coin, which requires the player to pull an amp so it activates a group of upside down extendable mushrooms in sequence, allowing a little Sparky to make its way across a gap to reach a metallic mushroom that pushes the 10 coin up to where the player can collect it. It's a bit of an overcomplicated setup in the way my bonus rooms often are, but I'm very proud of the way it efficiently ties into so many different ideas that were set up earlier in the level. The fact that the upside down mushrooms can easily crush stuff isn't an issue in the bonus room because the only thing that interacts with the mushrooms are the little Sparkies. It took honestly an enormous amount of fine-tuning to make all the parts of this one setup work without any jank, but I think I mostly managed it. Sometimes when designing levels, I come up with so many ideas that I still have a lot of stuff saved up by the time I reach the end. However, in this case, honestly most of what I'd come up with ahead of time all kind of led up to that complicated bonus room, so I didn't really have anything specific in mind for this section that leads into the wonder effect. So instead of doubling down on even more insanely convoluted puzzly setups, I decided this final stretch of the normal route of the level should form the climax of the metallic block gimmick by just consisting of one big platforming gauntlet. So I set up a large amount of blocks that could be electrified and made a bunch of amps move along them and basically prayed that it would make for an interesting section. As I've talked about before, although the complex puzzle contraptions that some of my levels revolve around are fun to come up with and set up, I don't honestly feel like they always make for the most interesting gameplay for the player. So therefore, I'm pretty happy with the way this level kinda consists of both overcomplicated contraptions and more straightforward platforming sections. Speaking of which, the wonder effect is basically a straightforward platforming section. Like I mentioned at the start of the video, it uses big floating water bubbles which the amps electrocute upon contact. I'll be interested to see how people feel about this wonder effect, given it seems like not all of you were a huge fan of the one in my previous custom level. It's sometimes hard to think of ways of reusing the original game's wonder effects in such a way that they tie into a level's custom gimmicks. I'm honestly very happy with the way I managed to naturally combine a wonder effect that I thought was pretty dull in the original game with a gimmick that was directly inspired by some old New Super Mario Bros. DS mod in a way that feels entirely natural and logical. But I can also see how on the surface this still isn't the most thrilling wonder effect section. I feel like the best wonder effects in the original game have a feeling of urgency or, well, wonder that can't always be replicated in more straightforward sections like this. That idea is also why I didn't even bother trying to implement some kind of more puzzle-focused setup into this section. Although I could have made it so the player would have to use a pulley to move amps away from some water bubbles or something, having to stand still and think about what to do in a section like that would completely kill the pacing of this part of the level, I think. In general, I made an effort to design this entire segment to involve as little waiting as possible, even though all the moving bubbles and amps mean there are a lot of cycle-based setups in this section. I guess technically an exception to that is the fact that the wonder effect ends in another vertical autoscroller. This part is very deliberately similar to the autoscroller that appears right after the checkpoint flag, though at the time I made that section, I don't think I had this one planned yet. Mechanically, the thing that makes this section more difficult and wondrous, I guess, is the fact that you're swimming in the stuff that gets electrified as opposed to standing on top of it. That might not seem like a massive difference, but it actually took a huge amount of fine-tuning before this section was even remotely playable without getting jump-scared by amps electrocuting your bubble every other second. I guess something else to mention is that I made this part of the level use the big angry-looking thunderclouds in the background. In the original game, those are only used during the lightning storm wonder effect in the level Downpour Uproar, but I felt like they were also the perfect fit for this section. Not only are they a nice way of hiding the fact that the factory background really isn't made to progress vertically, but I suppose they still also sort of evoke that idea of the player climbing through the clouds above the factory environment that I talked about earlier. Whilst I'm doing the final touches in terms of decorating the level here, something worth explaining is that towards the end of working on this level, a big breakthrough was made as far as Fushigi is concerned. As I've talked about in previous videos, we used to think that something about editing Wonder's models would always corrupt the game's files in a way to where those models couldn't be rendered using the in-game shaders in the editor anymore. So kinda recently a feature was implemented that would make it so custom models were rendered in the editor, but just not using their in-game shaders. But around the time I was working on this level, Nintendo, who works on Fushigi, realized that we'd just misunderstood the issue, and actually making custom models render properly in the editor was as simple as changing one line of code. So because of that, in the future these time-lapses should look a bit more appealing, I suppose. Anyways, that's the end of this time-lapse, so let's go check out the level in-game. Okay, and here we are. So I introduce the amps right at the start, obviously, and we also immediately have one of these pushable block puzzles, I guess you can say. They're not really puzzles, they're just like very simple. Yeah, but like I talked about during the time-lapse, I never really intended for the pushable blocks to become such a major part of the level, but they really are like kind of these like secondary mechanic in this early part at least. And we have a little pulley setup, which introduces the idea that then gets brought back later in the level, and yeah, here's another pushable block thing, and this leads into the first purple 10 coin actually, which is very early in the level, I suppose, and it's also very simple compared to the crazy bonus rooms that are a part of the second and third purple 10 coins, but that's usually how I design my levels. I just like having the first purple 10 coins sort of be integrated into the normal level environment to kind of also still, I guess, introduce gimmicks and whatnot. And speaking of introducing gimmicks, we have the metal blocks here. And yeah, I think these are pretty good. I think they're pretty natural feeling and naturally integrated into the level theming, so I think that works pretty well. Just kind of have some different like kind of platforming sections here. It's kind of funny because you need to kind of like precariously move around to that amp because that's the only time you can stand on that block there. So that kind of makes for a funny little interesting section. And then here I introduce little Sparkies, and also once again keep the pushable block gimmick active. I guess this is the first pushable block in the level that you actually need to do anything with in order to progress. The other ones are just optional basically. And yeah, this little Sparky setup here is a bit annoying sometimes, just the way like the hitbox works of those metal blocks, and like I don't know, it just feels a bit hard to predict and a bit hard to navigate around. So I've definitely taken damage there on accident quite a bit. In general, the way the hitboxes of the metal blocks of the electrified versions work really does make them a bit more annoying to work with and to play around, I feel like, than they would be had Nintendo made the mechanic, just because, well, I'll get into it in the custom actor creation video, but the way the hitbox works, yeah, maybe isn't quite perfect, but I guess it works. And yeah, here we have a bit of a wall jumping section, pretty simple. You do have to maybe sometimes wait around a bit there, but I think that's fine. There's no real other way of having that setup be set up. And speaking of waiting, we also have to wait here, but I feel like that's also fine because of the way the talking flower reacts. It kind of sets it up, and I think makes it feel pretty okay. And here we are. Yeah, so once again, kind of an early midway checkpoint for one of my levels, which I feel like is kind of typical, because we're like maybe a third of the way through, or maybe like 2/5, but definitely not halfway. But this just felt like the natural point to put the checkpoint, and also I liked having the checkpoint move along with you during this vertical autoscroller. I did debate maybe putting the checkpoint all the way up here, for example, but that just didn't feel right. I'm not sure why, honestly. But yeah, I really like the way all of those different enemies and whatnot all interacted with the metal floor, obviously, and also the way the metal floor slowly broke apart. I think that's all pretty cool. And yeah, here you can see that there were some wheels on this metal block, and that gave a way that you can push this metal block. And I really like having the introduction of this version of this gimmick be done through this like little secret setup. I think it's really quite fun and unique. And speaking of fun and unique, this bonus room idea is it's kind of strange. It's a bit more janky than I would have liked, like with all the way the stone blocks are there at first and then get deleted sort of randomly. It's not as smooth as I would have wanted, but still, like, the idea of the setup does work with the way you have to make the pushable blocks go back and forth, so you can enter the pipe and get to this section here. And yeah, now we introduce this pushable version of the metal block for players who hadn't gotten to the... oh, whoops, wait. There's some parts here where if you push it all the way, you get some coins like that. Yeah, but that served as the introduction for that mechanic if you hadn't gotten the bonus room for the second purple 10 coin. And now we reintroduce the pulley, so we can do a bit more interesting stuff with it, like right here. This setup is really cool. I think it does work really well. You can kind of probably just like wall jump up there right now, but I just like the way this all works with the way the coins also spawn. It all lines up rather perfectly, I feel like. And now we get to a bit of a convoluted section. I'm not maybe super happy with the way this part turned out, just because I originally had plans that I felt like were a bit more, like, I don't know, naturally integrated into the level design, but this section, the way it turned out, is kinda a bit strange. Like, it's just a weird mess of several different types of puzzles and ideas kind of all coming together. But that leads into the bonus room for the third purple 10 coin. And this did turn out pretty good, I think. It is a bit finicky sometimes, making sure there we go, the amp kind of has to cover both of the blocks at the same time to allow the little Sparky to move over. And there we go. I originally didn't have the amp get killed there when you get the purple 10 coin, but that just made it much easier to deal with, because otherwise you still had to dodge the amp whilst going for the 10 coin once that's been launched, and that just didn't really work. I felt that was a bit strange, still having there be a threat. So that I think this the way I did that ended up working much better by just having the amp be deleted. And yeah, this section is fine, you know, it's just kind of typical platforming. It's not nothing crazy, but I think it works. And that would be the end of the level, but we have this special looking block with the wonder flower symbol on it. And that turns into a wonder flower, and that leads into the wonder effect. So here we go. And yeah, here I immediately introduce the fact that the water bubbles can be electrocuted. I combined the word electrified and electrocuted there. Electrocuted, sure. The water bubbles can be electrified or electrocuted, and that's sort of the main gimmick for this wonder effect. So yeah, here once again, it can be a bit annoying, like waiting for the amp there, but I feel like that's where the talking flower really works nicely, is having a little voice line that kind of tides you over whilst you wait for stuff to line up. And yeah, so I think even though this section is a bit like cycle based and whatnot, it doesn't take that much waiting around in a way that feels like super pointless or anything. Like here again, this talking flower kind of talks, and then around the time it's done talking, you can progress and move up here. And now we're getting to the auto-scrolling section, which, you know, maybe isn't the most crazy thing gameplay-wise. It's a bit slow, but there really was no other way of designing this, because it is still quite precarious having to deal with the amps, like the way that amp there kind of electrocuted 3 different bubbles, and that one as well. And that already marks the end of the section. The section is really quite big, but it only takes me like a minute to play through on average, and I think that's actually kind of average for Wonder Effect sections, so I think that really works. Okay, yeah, but this is the end of the level, and therefore that also marks the end of this video, guys. So if you enjoyed, maybe consider leaving a like, or subscribing, or leaving a comment, or checking out my Discord server, or becoming a YouTube channel member to get early access to my videos. Thank you so much for watching, see you later, and bye bye!